failure of the opposition to make its immigration policy public is of grave concern, given that most commentators predict a Labor landslide at the next federal election. Labor will say they have an immigration policy, but the ALP national platform gives no indication of the level or mix of migrants to be given permanent visas each year. Instead, there are motherhood statements like "we celebrate immigration" and the miracle of multiculturalism. But there is no admission of the problems which have been caused by multiculturalism, which means these problems go unsolved. Voters have a right to know what Labor and their partners, the Greens, will do in government in respect to the number of permanent visas to be issued under the skilled program, family reunions and the humanitarian program. Labor has been coy about the immigration numbers because they know that if their base knew what they had in store for them, they would not vote for them. Labor knows commute times to work will double, access to hospitals and a good education will decrease if immigration rates continue, but they won't tell the voters the truth. Instead, Labor, they say immigration is good for the economy, but there is no evidence of that. It should be remembered that the economic miracle in Japan after World War II was achieved with no immigration at all. When Luke Foley, the Labor state leader in New South Wales, talked about white flight, he was quickly silenced because there is no place in Labor for the truth. The Coalition have set targets of around 220,000 permanent migrants a year in recent years, which is less than the 300,000 plus set by the Rudd government in 2013. To say Labor has been vague about their intentions in respect of immigration is an understatement. But we do know that anything Labor wants to do in respect of immigration will have to have the agreement of the Greens, because Labor needs the Greens to form government. Today, the Labor Mayor of Liverpool Council in Western Sydney has called for a bigger Australia. She says the only questions to be resolved are how much bigger and how quickly we want to get there. Ms Waller goes on to say that immigration has been great for our economy and that cultural diversity is our strength, but she seems not to know that most conflicts in the world are rooted in diversity. We need to find a balance between cultural diversity and an obligation to commit to our values and political institutions which guarantee our freedoms and liberal democracy. We are seen in parts of Australia because there are now significant geographical concentrations of overseas-born in Sydney and Melbourne, which suggests the past patterns of integration will not continue. If the current settlement patterns persist, we will end up like Europe. We already have electorates like Banks, Parramatta and Fowler, where the number of people born overseas far outweighs the numbers born in Australia. How does anyone expect these newcomers to integrate into Australia when most people around them were born overseas? One Nation's immigration policy is clearly set out on the One Nation website. Our policy recognises that large-scale migration in a country which cannot reproduce itself is bound to change the culture and ethnic makeup of Australia. We cannot unscramble the egg, but we can be honest and recognise that problems exist and they need to be solved, and solved now. I view with grave concern the fact that Labor and the Greens are satisfied that mastery of English can be established by getting 12 questions right in a 20 multiple-choice test. This standard is the lowest in the world for any comparable country, with the result that over 1 million people cannot speak English well or at all. This means a large number of people cannot participate in work or other aspects of our society. Labor and the Greens believe supporting low language standards for citizenship will win their candidates enough votes to deliver government, but they do newcomers a disservice because it is in the interest of migrants to master the language so they can fully engage in society. One Nation and the Greens see the future of Australia very differently. A recent survey found that the overwhelming majority of Greens voters do not take pride in the Australian way of life or believe that maintaining the Australian way of life and culture is important. Let me say that again. 75% of Green voters said that maintaining the Australian way of life and culture is unimportant. That doesn't really surprise me. I see the way they vote in this chamber. They are so wrong. The Australian way of life is worth keeping, and it is what I will fight for in this place. The Australian way of life is what attracts people to Australia, and it is what Australians have fought for in war and created by hard work and love of the country. The Australian way of life is the social glue that keeps us together. Social cohesion has been taken for granted by successive governments, as each year they set immigration targets without a thought about the cumulative effects on our society. The fact is, Labor and the Greens gagged debate on my proposal in the plebiscite Future Migration Level Bill 2018 to give Australians a say in the level of immigration at the next federal election. The last thing Labor wants is a reduced level of immigration because it has been known since the days of Barry Jones that newcomers to Australia tend to vote Labor. The voices of minority groups are overrepresented in Parliament because the major political parties take for granted the silent majority and pander to minorities, which can make the difference between winning and losing a seat in Parliament. Labor says multiculturalism has been a miracle, but the truth is that multiculturalism has been a mix of success and failure. Don't get me wrong, there have been many successes, and I applaud the hard-working Asian families. It is, however, time to deal with the failures of multiculturalism, which we see as culturally separate communities, because in these communities a shared sense of national identity is weak. In these circumstances, the identity is replaced by a religious or ethnic identity. Today we are seeing clear evidence of cultural separatism by some migrants. The Greens political party represents the rights of those culturally separate communities to remain separate, and Labor in government will be forced to bend to the Greens. Some migrants from the Middle East have formed culturally separate communities where they keep the language, custom and culture of their homeland in an attempt to recreate their villages of their birth. They reject our way of life and our values, but not our welfare system and not our free health system. Just take the train from Sydney to Bankstown, walk down the main street of Lakemba and other nearby suburbs and count the number of bulk billing medical practices and look at the statistics for welfare payments by postcode. It is here that English is not spoken well or at all. Employment participation is low and welfare dependency is high. These communities are bad for social cohesion, bad for the economy and bad for national security, because amongst this group are those who want to Islamise Australia. Federal politicians want to minimise the perception of national security problems arising from these communities, but you cannot ignore the spending by state and federal governments in respect of Islamic terrorism. Every major city has seen changes to their public spaces with concrete bollards placed so as to impede an extremist from murdering people with a vehicle. Here in the Parliament we agreed to spend $160 million to strengthen security because of extremism, and we know that is Islamic extremism. Let me be clear, I appreciate Australian Muslims are a diverse group, but a significant minority of Australian Muslims told the Scanlon survey they don't feel Australian, and because that they reject our way of life, our values and our institutions, and they want to change Australia. I ask voters to look at the One Nation immigration policy, which is up on our website. The policy is well balanced and carefully thought through. I make no excuse for putting the interest of citizens first.